She came into this world under a shadow. No one remembered the hour, no one cared for the day. There was no midwife's smile, no proud father's hands, no sound of a child's first cry. Only silence, a silence so complete, so hollow, it clung to her from the first breath and never let go. Her mother was already fading when she gave birth, too young, too thin, with eyes dimmed by hunger. Her father was a drifter, a man whose spirit had long been beaten by debt, whiskey, and failure. By the time Ilara could walk, she was already alone. By the time she could remember, she was already forgotten. The shack where she lived was not a home. It was a leaning skeleton of wood, built where the land itself seemed to wither. Dust crept through every crack. The wind howled through its walls. And when storms swept across the plain, the whole structure shivered, as though it wished it too could collapse and be done with the suffering. The land around her offered no kindness. Summers scorched the skin, baking the earth until it split open like old scars. Winters sank their claws deep, freezing every breath into knives. The rains, when they came, tore the ground into rivers of mud, only to vanish again into drought. This was not a land of promise, it was a land of survival, and survival demanded a price. As a child, she scavenged what she could: wild roots, water from broken wells, scraps left behind by coyotes. She grew thin, not from laziness, but from the world refusing to give. And when she wandered to town, hoping for mercy, she found none. The townsfolk looked past her as if she were smoke, invisible, meaningless. If anyone noticed her, it was only to whisper that she was a curse, a reminder of death and misfortune. So she learned early what others never needed to know, that no one was coming to save her, that the world cared little if she lived or died, that in the silence of her days, the only promise she could trust was the one she made to herself. Her nights were the longest. She would lie awake in the shack, the roof groaning above her, the cold pressing in, her stomach gnawing at itself. In that emptiness, she would listen, the distant thunder of hooves rolling across the plains, the lonely howl of wolves splitting the stillness, the far-off crack of rifles carried on the wind. She listened, and she remembered. Her silence was not weakness. It was sharpening her, hardening her, making her into something the world did not expect. The girl grew taller. The years carved lean strength into her limbs. Hunger etched sharpness into her face. But more than that, the silence left a mark inside her that could not be erased. Others lived for comfort. Others lived for wealth, or family, or pride. Ilara lived for endurance. She lived for defiance. She lived because she refused to let the world bury her, and in the quiet corners of her mind, something else began to grow. A thought, a hunger not of the body, but of the spirit. She wanted more than scraps, more than survival. She wanted a place in the world that could not be taken. She wanted to carve her own mark into the earth so deeply that no storm, no man, no power could erase it. But dreams like that are dangerous in a land like hers. Dreams of rising, dreams of power. The land crushed such dreams with an iron hand. It smothered them in dust, drowned them in hunger, buried them in silence. Yet Ilara did not let go. For each day she rose from her bed of splintered boards. Each day she fought to keep breath in her chest. Each day she endured. And in that endurance, in that refusal to surrender, the spark of something greater began to burn. The girl the world had forgotten, the child left to fade. She was still standing, still breathing, still unbroken, and that alone was the first act of rebellion. The desert night was never kind, but that night it was merciless. The sky roared with thunder, splitting open as if heaven itself had torn at the seams. Lightning crashed across the horizon, bathing the barren land in a cold, blinding light. The wind whipped with a rage that rattled bones and bent the tallest mesquite trees until they nearly broke. Elara pressed forward through the storm. Her body was soaked, her thin coat clinging to her frame. She had no reason to be there, no purpose but survival. Yet the storm carried her, dragging her steps across the wasteland until she stumbled upon a sight that would mark the beginning of everything. Ahead lay the scattered remains of a wagon train, splintered wood, broken wheels, torn canvas, flapping like wounded wings in the storm. The earth was littered with ash, bones, and rusted chains, all half buried beneath shifting sand. The storm had uncovered what time tried to forget. Elara stepped closer, lightning flashing to reveal the wreckage in cruel clarity. There had been death here, long ago perhaps, or maybe not long enough. The air still carried a bitterness, the kind that lingers after fire and screams. She moved cautiously, her bare feet crunching over the bones of wheels, her hands brushing away layers of sand from half-hidden relics. And then she saw it. A chest. It was blackened, scarred by fire, its metal bands warped from heat. It sat half-buried beneath a broken wagon beam, as though the desert itself had tried to consume it. Elara's pulse quickened. She dug at the sand with her hands, shoving aside the wood, pulling until her fingers bled. The storm raged above, lightning cracking so close the air shuddered, but she did not stop. At last, the chest broke free. She dragged it into the open and forced the lid apart. The hinges screamed, rust flaking into the wind. And inside, she found not grain, not clothes, not food. She found weapons, rifles, their barrels dulled but unbroken. Revolvers heavy in the hand, even after years of silence. Knives, blades darkened with age but still sharp enough to cut. It was a graveyard of steel, forgotten like her, waiting in silence for someone desperate enough to claim them. Elara stared at the weapons as lightning split the sky again. Her reflection flickered in the steel. Thin, hollow-eyed, a girl the world had discarded. But in that reflection, she saw something else. Power. It was not food, it was not water, but it was the one thing she had never held before, a chance. A weapon did not care if you were rich or poor, loved or hated, forgotten or feared. A weapon leveled the earth. A weapon gave the powerless a voice that could not be ignored. She touched the cold barrel of a rifle, and the storm seemed to quiet for one heartbeat. For the first time in her life, she felt something greater than survival. She felt the possibility of shaping her own fate. Elara gathered the weapons piece by piece, dragging them back to her shack as the storm howled and the earth shook. Her body ached, her hands raw, but she did not stop. The fire inside her burned hotter than the storm above. By the time the dawn came, the wreckage lay silent once more. The storm had passed, leaving only mud and shattered branches. But in that shack of rotting wood, Elara sat with her prize. Rifles laid across the floor, revolvers lined in neat rows, knives gleaming faintly in the rising light. She looked at them not as tools of death, but as the beginning of something greater. She was no longer only the forgotten girl, no longer just a shadow on the edge of other people's stories. The chest of weapons had given her more than steel. It had given her purpose. It had given her fire. It had given her the first piece of a destiny she had never dared to imagine. The storm had not destroyed her. It had delivered her. And from that night onward, she would not be silent. She would not fade. She would carry her weapons, carry her will, and carve her mark upon the world. The forgotten girl had found her spark. And when sparks find the right kindling, they become a fire that nothing can contain. The days after the storm were unlike any that had come before. For the first time, Elara woke not with hunger gnawing at her belly, not with dread pressing on her chest, but with purpose. The weapons were laid out in her shack like treasures unearthed from another world, rusted, battered, heavy, but alive with promise. She cleaned them as best she could, scraped the rust with stone, oiled the parts with animal fat, wrapped the barrels in cloth to keep the dust from creeping in. Each piece of steel became a companion, A reminder that she no longer belonged to the silence, a promise that her fate would not be written in hunger alone. But weapons without will are nothing. They are only cold metal sleeping until awakened by fire. And so Ilara set out into the desert, carrying a rifle across her back, a revolver at her side. She began small. She watched the greedy merchants who roamed the trails, their wagons stacked with goods bought cheap and sold at 10 times the price to desperate settlers. She learned their routes, their habits, the ways they cheated the weak. When she struck, it was quick and unseen, a wagon left overturned, a chest of supplies taken in the night, enough food to keep her alive, enough goods to scatter among the forgotten souls who starved in silence. The whispers began almost at once. They said someone was moving through the wastelands, someone unseen, a shadow in the storm. Some called her a thief. Others said she was a ghost, risen from the bones of the desert to punish the greedy. No one knew her name, for she had none that mattered. But the whispers carried far, curling into saloons, drifting through mining camps, slipping into the ears of those who had long since given up hope. The whispers grew stronger when her strikes continued. A rancher known for breaking men beneath his heel found his cattle scattered into the wild, his barns set aflame. A sheriff who took coin to turn his gaze from cruelty woke to find his jailhouse emptied and his pockets stripped of gold. Always the strikes came swift and vanished like smoke, and still no one saw her clearly. Only the results. Only the dust left behind where injustice had once stood. The whispers began to call her something new. Not a ghost, not a thief, a spark. For sparks can spread, sparks can burn, sparks can light fires in places where the world has grown cold. Among the outcasts, the broken, the forgotten, the whispers became a lifeline. If there was truly a spark moving through the wasteland, then perhaps they too could rise from the dust. Perhaps they too could matter once more. Unseen, Ilara watched them. The deserters who drifted from town to town, hated by all, trusted by none. The widows who carried grief heavier than any rifle. The miners broken by collapse, their bodies twisted, their futures stolen. She saw them because she was them. But she was different. She carried steel, she carried fire, and in her silence, in her relentless endurance, she carried something none of them had dared to believe in for years. She carried defiance. The world thought her strikes were accidents, coincidence, luck, but they were not. They were deliberate steps. Each raid was a test. Each victory, no matter how small, was proof. Proof that even the weakest, even the forgotten, could leave a mark deep enough to shake those who believed themselves untouchable. The whispers carried further, from the towns into the camps, from the camps into the canyons, and the broken began to listen. They began to wonder, could the spark be real? Could a girl, nameless and unseen, truly stand against the weight of the West? Ilara never sought the whispers. She did not care if they named her spirit or thief. What mattered was the truth they carried. The world was changing, the silence was cracking, and though she did not yet know it, those whispers would soon bring her more than fear. They would bring her the broken ones. They would bring her the desperate. They would bring her the outcasts, carrying their pain, their scars, and their fire. And with them, the spark would find its kindling. The whispers spread farther with each passing week, and in their wake they carried more than rumors. They carried footsteps, the kind of footsteps made by those who had nowhere else to walk. They came one by one, outcasts, drifters, men and women the world had cast aside like scraps unfit even for dogs. They did not come seeking glory. They did not come seeking wealth. They came because they had nothing left, and because whispers told them that somewhere in the wasteland a spark had caught flame. The first was a deserter. Once a soldier in a war, fought for men richer than he could imagine. He had marched across rivers, through fire, beneath banners that promised honor, but delivered only death. When he fled the battlefield, branded a coward, he carried scars not only on his flesh, but on his soul. No one trusted him. no one wanted him. But when he heard of a girl who struck against oppressors, unseen and unbroken, he followed the trail until he found her shadow. The second was a miner, his body broken when the earth caved in, trapping him in darkness for 3 days before he clawed his way free. His legs never healed, his lungs carried the dust of the mine, rattling with every breath. The company abandoned him, a cripple too costly to feed. But his hands still knew dynamite, still knew how to shape destruction with precision. When the whispers reached him, he limped through the wasteland, determined that his knowledge would not rot in silence. The third was a widow. Once, she'd been a wife, a mother, a keeper of a small home where laughter lived. But raiders took it all, left her with nothing but a rifle heavier than her grief. She carried it across the plains, her eyes hollow, her steps unyielding. When the whispers found her, she did not weep, she did not ask. She simply followed, as though she had always been waiting for someone to show her the way to vengeance. Others followed. A ranch hand who fled a master's cruelty, a gambler who had lost more than he ever won, a thief whose hands shook from hunger but whose eyes still burned with defiance. They were the forgotten, the broken, the ones the world would never count in its ledgers. Ilara watched them. She measured them not by words, but by the weight of their scars, not by promises, but by how they endured. She saw herself in them, reflections of her own silence and fire, but she did not welcome them with open arms. She demanded proof. She worked beside them. She bled beside them. She carried water when others faltered, shouldered burdens when others bent, faced hardship without flinching. In every act, she showed them that survival was not enough, that endurance was not weakness, that together their brokenness could become something unbreakable. At first they doubted. They mocked her size, her youth, the idea that a girl the world had forgotten could lead them anywhere but to death. They tested her with cruel words, with bitter glares, with challenges born of despair. But she never broke. When they jeered, she stood taller. When they doubted, she endured longer. When they cursed her, she answered not with anger, but with a fire that refused to be quenched. And slowly, something changed. The deserter, who trusted no one, began to walk at her side. The miner, crippled and weary, began to shape traps and fires at her command. The widow, cold and silent, began to guard her as if guarding her own lost kin. One by one, the broken began to bend toward her fire. It was not loyalty built on promises of wealth or power. It was not devotion forged by honeyed words. It was trust born in hardship, respect carved out of endurance, faith drawn from a girl who refused to crumble no matter how heavy the world pressed against her. The forgotten had found one of their own, and in her they saw something they had long since lost. A reason to rise, a reason to fight, a reason to believe that even the shattered could become sharp enough to cut. The girl was no longer alone, and though their numbers were small, though their weapons were few, though their scars ran deep, they carried something the world had never expected from them. They carried the beginning of an army. The spark of rebellion does not burn without fuel, and fuel in a land ruled by cruelty was not scarce. Every road carried wagons heavy with supplies stolen from the people. Every town bore scars of tacksmen who drained blood and coin alike. Every fortress stood as a monument to power bought with suffering. Ilara and her broken band had whispered long enough. Now they would strike. The deserter knew of a convoy, a line of wagons guarded by soldiers who marched with arrogance, believing no one dared to challenge them. The miners had worked those same roads. The widow had buried her kin because of them. To strike there would not only wound the oppressors, but feed the starving. So they planned, not with the polish of trained generals, not with maps drawn on parchment gilded in candlelight, but with hands tracing lines in dirt, with stones marking wagons, with branches marking soldiers, with fire in their eyes and hunger in their bones. The miner prepared dynamite, small charges wrapped in rags. The deserter studied routes, counting the time it took soldiers to march between ridges. The widow watched the road from the hills, waiting, silent as the grave she carried in her heart. And when the day came, the air felt heavy. Even the wind carried tension. The earth beneath their feet seemed to wait with them, as though holding its breath. They struck as the convoy entered a narrow pass. Explosions lit the rocks, echoing like thunder. Dust and smoke filled the air, choking cries of surprise. Horses screamed, wagons tilted, soldiers scrambled in chaos. For a moment it seemed as though they had won. For a heartbeat, the forgotten became giants. They tore through confusion, weapons raised, eyes blazing with the fury of the abandoned. But arrogance was not the only thing the soldiers carried. They carried training. They carried discipline. They carried numbers. And soon the smoke cleared. The forgotten, small in number, found themselves surrounded by steel. The deserter fought like a man desperate to erase shame. The widow fired until her rifle clicked empty. The miner, coughing blood from dust and strain, tried to light one last charge with trembling hands. But chaos turned to order. Fear turned to control. The convoy pushed back. The wagons were not lost. The soldiers drove them away with force, leaving the ground littered with failure. When the smoke settled, the forgotten lay bruised, battered, broken. They dragged themselves to the cover of rocks, breath ragged, eyes wide with disbelief. Victory had slipped from their fingers like water poured into sand. Some cursed, some wept, some stared in silence, their hope bleeding out with their wounds. For many, the dream of an unstoppable army seemed nothing but a cruel jest, a fire too small to warm the night. But Ilara did not break. She bore the bruises, she carried the pain, yet she looked upon the wounded faces and saw not defeat, but truth. They were weak. They were unprepared. They had dared to fight a storm with sparks and thought themselves fire. Failure had come, but failure was not the end. She lifted her head, and though she spoke no words, her presence burned. In her eyes shone something harder than steel, sharper than blades, brighter than the fire of their first charge. It was resolve. They would rise again. They would learn. They would become more than survivors, grasping at scraps of courage. For even in failure, the forgotten had tasted what it meant to strike back. And once a starving heart has tasted power, it cannot go back to hunger without dreaming of more. The battle was lost, but the war had only just begun. Defeat lingered like smoke. It clung to the air, it clung to the skin, it clung to the heart. The forgotten sat in silence after the convoy disaster, their bodies bruised, their pride shattered. Some nursed wounds that would not soon heal. Others stared at the dirt as if searching for an answer hidden in the dust. Hope felt fragile, thin as glass, ready to break with the slightest touch. But Ilara did not allow the silence to consume them. She carried her own wounds, yet she bore them without complaint. She walked among the broken with steady steps, not offering comfort, not offering false promises. Instead, she offered presence. Her very stillness told them this was not the end. Failure had been their first true teacher, and Ilara would not waste the lesson. The deserter, hardened by war, understood now what it meant to face an enemy trained to fight as one. He began to teach the band not just how to swing a weapon, but how to move together, how to watch each other's backs, how to listen for commands, not spoken but signaled in silence. The widow, who had fired until her weapon failed, taught them the patience of the hunter, that a single bullet placed true was worth more than a storm of wild shots. She showed them how to steady their breath, how to wait for the right moment, how to make every strike count. The miner broken in body but sharp in mind, taught them the power of the earth itself. He showed them how to place traps in paths, how to turn stones into weapons, how to wield fire and powder with precision. What his legs had lost, his hands and knowledge gave back in strength. And Ilara, she learned as much as she taught. She trained beside them, never above them. When they ran, she ran. When they stumbled, she stumbled. When they bled, she bled. In every hardship, she placed herself among them, proving with action that she was not a leader born of title, but of endurance. The days turned into weeks, and the land became their crucible. They trained in the burning sun, beneath storms that tore at their skin, in nights colder than stone. They grew leaner, sharper, harder. Hunger no longer weakened them, it sharpened their edge. Pain no longer broke them, it built their armor. Still, there were moments when despair crept back, moments when the weight of their scars whispered that they were only broken pieces, never whole. But Ilara answered despair with fire. She did not raise her voice. She did not fill the air with empty words. Instead, she fought longer, stood straighter, endured more than any of them. Her example silenced doubt better than any speech ever could. And slowly, the broken began to believe. They began to move with purpose, to strike with unity, to think not as individuals fighting for scraps, but as one body, one will, one blade forged in struggle. It was not perfection, it was not yet enough to topple the mighty, but it was more than what they had been. It was the first step in becoming something the world had never expected from them. The forgotten were learning to become a force. And in the shadows of their training, the land began to notice. Whispers grew louder, stories spread faster, that somewhere in the wasteland, the discarded and the broken were rising under the hand of a girl no one had thought would matter, a girl who carried lessons written in blood. The weeks of struggle hardened them, but training alone could not prove their worth. An army, no matter how small, is not forged in silence. It is tested in fire. That fire came sooner than expected. The miners' scouts discovered a patrol, 10 men riding the dusty road, armed and armored, arrogant in the safety of their numbers. They were not a convoy. They carried no wagons of supplies. They were enforcers, sent to keep the land in fear, to remind the weak who ruled. In years past, the forgotten would have hidden, waiting for the danger to pass. But not now. Not after blood had been spilled, not after the hunger for justice had begun to burn in their veins. This time, they chose to strike. The plan was simple. The widow would take position in the rocks, her rifle aimed at the lead rider. The deserter would guide the fighters in a half-circle trap, flanking both sides. The miner, though frail in body, prepared a crude but deadly gift, an explosive charge hidden beneath loose soil, ready to shatter the road at the right moment. Ilara oversaw it all. Her heart pounded, but she did not falter. This was the test they had been waiting for. This was where training became truth. The patrol rode into the trap unaware, their laughter carried on the wind. They saw no threat in the barren land, no danger in the silence of the rocks. Then the earth exploded. The blast threw men and horses alike into chaos. Dust and fire swallowed the road. Before the soldiers could recover, the widow's rifle cracked and the lead rider fell. The deserters' flankers surged forward, striking with a unity they had never known before. The forgotten fought not as scattered survivors, but as one. Their steps matched, their strikes flowed. Their will, sharpened by weeks of blood and pain, carried them farther than fear could reach. The soldiers resisted, trained and disciplined, but discipline faltered under surprise. Order crumbled when the ground itself turned against them. Their swords rang against rifles, their cries echoed off stone, but one by one they fell beneath the fury of those they had once ignored. The battle was brief, but it felt eternal, and when the dust cleared, the forgotten stood. For the first time they had struck, and prevailed. The cost was not light. Some bore wounds deep enough to scar for life. One among them bled out in the dirt, his last breath carried away by the wind. But this time, unlike the convoy disaster, the dead were not mourned in silence and shame. They were honored. Their sacrifice carried not as failure but as proof. Proof that they could fight, proof that they could win. The patrol lay scattered, their weapons and supplies now in the hands of the forgotten. But more than steel and bullets had been claimed that day. They had claimed belief. When they marched back to camp, their steps were heavier, their bodies exhausted, but their eyes burned with a fire no storm could snuff out. They had faced the oppressors in open combat, and for once it was the oppressors who bled. Ilara stood at the heart of them, her face marked with dust and sweat, her body aching, but her spirit unbroken. She saw what they did not yet see, the shape of something greater forming in the ashes of their pain. This was not just a band of survivors, not any more. This was the beginning of an army. And with their first true victory carved into memory, the world beyond the hills would no longer laugh at whispers of rebellion. The whispers had teeth now. The whispers carried weight. The whispers spoke of a girl, once forgotten, who had dared to rise. And with every passing day, those whispers grew louder. Victory is a dangerous gift. It lifts the spirit, but it also paints a target. The forgotten had claimed their first triumph, but triumph never goes unnoticed in a land ruled by iron fists. The patrol they had slain was not missed for long. When the bodies were found, when the weapons were gone, when whispers reached the ears of the powerful, the land trembled. The oppressors were not blind. They knew rebellion when they smelled its smoke. And in the ashes of that patrol, they smelled a fire that threatened to spread. Retaliation came swiftly. Riders swept across the plains, searching, scouring, leaving villages smoldering in their wake. Innocents who had nothing to do with Ilara's band paid the price, beaten, burned, broken. The message was clear. Defiance would not be tolerated. The forgotten watched from the hills, their hearts heavy with rage. They had struck a blow, but now the weight of vengeance fell not only upon them, but upon the weak who could not fight back. Ilara felt the burden sharper than any wound. She had led them into battle. She had lit the fire. Now the fire spread beyond her reach, and innocence burned in its light. Yet she did not turn back. She knew retreat would only bring the same fate, only slower, only crueler. Instead, she chose to turn pain into steel. She hardened their training. The deserter drilled them with greater precision, driving them past exhaustion. The widow honed their aim until every shot carried purpose. The miner crafted new traps, shaping powder and stone into weapons of terror. But training alone could not shield them from the storm that was coming. Scouts brought word of enemy movements. Companies of soldiers, larger and better armed, sweeping outward like a net to catch prey. The forgotten were no longer hunters. They were hunted. Nights became restless. Fires were kept low. Meals eaten in silence. They moved often, never staying long enough to leave tracks. Every shadow felt like an enemy. Every gust of wind carried the scent of danger, and yet fear did not break them. Fear sharpened them. They learned to vanish into the land, moving like smoke, striking like wolves, retreating before larger forces could pin them down. The deserter called it survival. Ilara called it preparation. The retaliation of their enemy was fierce, but in that fury, the forgotten discovered something vital. The more the enemy searched, the more resources they wasted, the more villages they burned, the more hatred they sowed. And the more hatred they sowed, the more the whispers spread. What began as a spark in silence grew into a murmur carried across plains, across rivers, across mountains. A murmur of rebellion. But Ilara knew whispers would not win the war. The shadow of retaliation loomed large, and sooner or later the enemy would find them. Sooner or later they would be forced into a battle not of their choosing, and when that day came, the forgotten would need to be ready. Not just to survive, but to endure. Not just to fight, but to prove that their flame could withstand the storm. The shadow of retaliation had fallen across the land, but shadows, no matter how deep, could not exist without light. And Ilara was determined to be that light. The enemy's shadow stretched long across the plains. Soldiers marched in greater numbers now, their banners dark against the horizon, their boots grinding dust into the earth. Villages whispered of the girl and her growing band, but they also whispered of soldiers who punished defiance with fire. The Forgotten could not meet such power in open battle, not yet. To stand in the daylight against trained companies was to invite death, and so they turned to the night. Ilara's army became a whisper within a whisper. They moved beneath moonlight, cloaked in silence. They struck not where the enemy was strong, but where they were weakest. The widow watched the roads and chose the moments when wagons rolled with fewer guards. The deserter led small groups into camps, stealing food, weapons and horses, before slipping away into darkness. The miner planted fire in unexpected places, powder packed into barrels, set to ignite when no watchful eye remained. One night, an enemy camp awoke to find half its tents aflame, horses scattered, powder stores lost to fire. Another morning, soldiers discovered a bridge collapsed into a river, their supplies sinking into the current. Patrols vanished into narrow passes and never returned, swallowed by landslides, carefully set in motion by unseen hands. The Forgotten had become blades in the dark. Each strike carried risk. Each mission weighed heavily. The cost of failure was death without mercy, yet they pressed on, not out of recklessness, but because every strike mattered. Every stolen bullet, every shattered bridge, every lost patrol slowed the hand of the oppressors. And as the enemy grew frustrated, as their supply lines thinned and their soldiers marched weary, the whispers grew louder still. Villagers, once too afraid to even meet the gaze of rebellion, began leaving food where none could see, water left in clay jugs at the edges of trails. Some offered bandages, others news of troop movements. Not all were brave enough to join, but enough believed to help. The Forgotten were no longer entirely alone. The land itself began to rise quietly with them, but the danger was greater than ever. The enemy had begun to adapt. Their camps grew tighter, their patrols sharper, their traps more cunning. Hunters now hunted by those they sought to outsmart, and within the ranks of the Forgotten, questions grew. How long could they keep fighting in shadows before the storm finally caught them? How long could they strike and vanish before the noose closed in? Ilara carried these doubts in silence, but she also carried something else. The memory of their first failure, the sting of defeat, and the lessons carved deep since then. She knew the storm was coming. She knew they could not forever remain hidden blades, but she also knew every day they survived, every wound they inflicted, brought them closer to becoming something greater. For an army does not rise in a single battle. It rises in the dark, one strike at a time. And though the enemy's power still towered above them, cracks had begun to show, and through those cracks light would pour. Every struggle has a moment when the tide begins to shift, a moment when doubt bends into belief, when fear gives way to courage, when whispers become a roar. For Ilara and her band, that moment did not come in silence or in shadow. It came with fire. The enemy had grown careless in their anger. Convinced the Forgotten would forever strike like thieves in the night, they grew bold with their supply trains, pushing heavy wagons through the plains with fewer guards than wisdom advised. They believed their sheer presence was enough to deter attack. It was a mistake Ilara would not let pass. The deserter scouted the route, wide open, no cover, but scattered rocks and dry gullies. The widow counted guards, their numbers smaller than expected. The miner studied the terrain, nodding at ridges where powder could speak louder than steel. It was dangerous, too dangerous for those who had always lived in shadows. But Ilara knew it was more than an opportunity. It was a necessity. The forgotten had survived long enough. They had struck and run long enough. Now they needed a victory so great, so undeniable, that the land itself would believe in them, so they prepared with care, sharpened by desperation. The widow chose high ground for her shot. The miner buried charges along the road. The deserter divided their force into three, one to strike from the front, one from the flank, and one to cut off retreat. When the wagons came, the earth trembled beneath their wheels. Horses snorted, guards marched lazily, unaware that death waited just beyond sight. Then the charges erupted. Flame and smoke swallowed the lead wagon, shattering wood and throwing riders into the dirt. The widow's rifle cracked, dropping the captain before he could rally. The deserters' fighters surged from hiding, striking with precision, their movements sharp, disciplined. Chaos consumed the road. Guards scrambled, shouting orders that vanished beneath gunfire and screams. Horses bolted, wagons overturned. The forgotten pressed hard, striking not as scattered survivors, but as a unit forged in pain and fire. For the first time, the battle did not teeter between victory and loss. This time they dominated. The widow's bullets found their marks, steady and sure. The deserters' commands kept the fighters tight, blades and bullets moving as one. The miners' fire spread, cutting off retreat and sealing the enemy in their trap. And at the heart of it all was Ilara, her presence unshaken, her resolve unbreakable. She fought not with words, but with action, pushing forward where fear would have pulled back, holding firm where doubt threatened to crack their will. When the dust cleared, the wagons lay in ruin. Supplies, food, powder, rifles were in the hands of the forgotten. The guards, once arrogant, were scattered or slain, and for the first time the forgotten had claimed not just survival, not just scraps, but true power. Word spread swiftly. Villagers heard not of shadows stealing in the night, but of a bold strike in broad daylight, of an enemy humiliated, of an army rising, and something shifted in the hearts of the people. Whispers turned into shouts, fear bent into hope. Men and women who had once looked away now looked forward, their eyes searching for the girl who led the forgotten. Some came with offerings of food, others came with weapons hidden for years. And still more came with nothing but their broken hands and the will to fight. Ilara's army was no longer a scattered band. It was no longer just the broken. It was growing into something the enemy could no longer ignore. The forgotten had reached their turning point, and from this moment forward, the land itself would never be the same. Growth is never free. Power always demands its price. After the turning point, the forgotten were no longer a handful of desperate survivors. They were swelling, drawing new blood from villages, from outcasts, from all who had suffered under the weight of oppression. What began as a spark had become a flame, and flames draw both warmth and danger. At first the growth felt like triumph. Camps grew larger, fires burned brighter, supplies filled sacks and wagons. Men and women who had once starved now stood armed and ready. Songs began to drift at night, songs of vengeance, songs of hope. But with growth came burden. More mouths to feed meant more raids, more weapons to arm meant more risks. More voices in camp meant more opinions, more disputes, more chance for doubt to spread. The deserter, once able to train a handful, now found himself stretched thin, barking orders to dozens who did not yet understand the discipline of war. The widow, patient with a few, now cursed the impatience of many. The miner, frail in body, worked until his hands bled, shaping traps and fire enough to arm an army that demanded too much, and Ilara, she bore the heaviest weight. Every new recruit looked to her as if she carried answers carved in stone. Every wounded soul sought her strength as if it could erase their pain. Every scarred fighter demanded that she lead them into glory. But she knew better. She knew that every decision now carried not only risk, but consequence measured in lives. To march meant some would never return. To wait meant others might starve. To strike meant villages might suffer retaliation. Each choice was a blade pressed to her throat. And as her army grew, so too did the enemy's wrath. They no longer sent patrols. They no longer underestimated her band. Now they sent columns, companies armed with steel and gunpowder, men bred for war. The forgotten were strong, but they were not invincible. Battles became bloodier. Victories came with heavier costs. A raid on supplies might bring food, but leave 3 comrades in shallow graves. A trap might topple a wagon, but the return fire might cripple twice as many. The songs at night grew softer. The laughter grew rarer. Faces once bright with hope now carried shadows, and Ilara felt those shadows pressing against her heart. She remembered the faces of the fallen, the deserter's young recruit who bled out in her arms, the widow's friend who never returned from patrol, the miner's apprentice crushed in a blast gone wrong. They had believed in her. They had followed her, and they had died beneath her banner. It was the price of power. Yet she did not falter. She bore the grief in silence. She carried the weight so others could still stand. She reminded them not with words, but with her unbroken presence, that their suffering was not in vain. For even in loss, they had carved something undeniable. The enemy no longer ruled unchallenged. The people no longer trembled in silence. The forgotten no longer hid in shadows of despair. An army was rising, and though power demanded its toll, though every step forward was bought with blood, Ilara knew there was no turning back. The girl who had once been overlooked, discarded, forgotten, now carried the fate of many upon her shoulders, and she would not let them fall. Darkness does not always come from the setting sun. Sometimes it falls from fire, from ruin, from choices that cannot be undone. The army of the forgotten had risen high, and with that rise came the eyes of their enemy. No longer did their foes underestimate them. No longer did they send scouts to probe or small detachments to harass. This time they came with full intent, an iron march, burning to crush the spark before it became a wildfire. It happened at dawn. The camp still slept in uneasy silence when the horizon bloomed with smoke. Not the smoke of their own fires, the smoke of war. The enemy had found them, and they had come prepared. They descended with rifles, with torches, with merciless order. The traps the miner had set bought them minutes, but only minutes. The barricades of logs and earth shook beneath the thunder of guns. The deserter and his fighters fought with ferocity, holding ground until their arms went numb. The widow rallied those who could not flee, turning fear into stubborn resistance. But the enemy was relentless. The forgotten bled. They fell back. They broke into scattered knots of resistance, fighting for every inch, every breath, every heartbeat. By the time the sun climbed high, the camp was no more. Tents had turned to ash. Wagons lay shattered. The ground was blackened, soaked with blood and smoke. And among the wreckage, the forgotten stood fewer than before. Ilara walked the field when the fighting ceased, her boots sinking into mud, darkened with loss. The songs were gone. The laughter was gone. Only silence remained. Silence broken by the crackling of burning timbers and the cries of the wounded. It was the greatest wound her army had suffered. The deserter stood bloodied, his men scattered. The widow knelt beside a lifeless friend, her hands shaking with fury and grief. The miner stared at the ruins of his work, eyes hollow, as if every fire he had lit now burned inside him. And Ilara, she felt the crushing weight of failure. For the first time since she began this journey, she wondered if the dream had been too great, if the burden she carried was heavier than she could endure, if the forgotten would scatter back into shadows, broken beyond repair. But despair has a way of sharpening resolve. That night, among the ashes of all they had built, Ilara stood before the survivors. She carried no weapon, no banner, only the fire in her voice and the steel in her gaze. She did not promise an easy road. She did not promise safety. She promised only one thing, that those who had fallen would not be forgotten, that the blood shed in the dirt would not be wasted, that from this ruin they would rise stronger, fiercer, unbreakable. And in that vow an oath was forged. The forgotten placed their grief in her hands. They gave their rage to her cause. They swore beneath the open sky, among the ashes of their dead, that they would never bow again. What had been broken would be rebuilt. What had been burned would be reborn. What had been lost would become the foundation of something greater. It was no longer a band, no longer a gathering of strays. From this night onward, it became something else. A brotherhood, a sisterhood, an army bound not only by need, but by oath. And from the ashes of ruin, a new fire began to burn. The ashes of defeat lingered long after the fires went cold. The air itself carried the scent of ruin, and every survivor bore scars that cut deeper than flesh. Yet, from that ruin, something hardened, something sharpened. Ilara's army was no longer naive. No longer did they believe victory would come easily, or that hope alone could shield them from steel and gunpowder. They had seen the true face of war, and it had left its mark upon them, and so they began again. This time, not with reckless camps sprawled across open fields, but with hidden outposts carved into hillsides, caves, and forests. They learned to move like shadows, to strike like storms, to vanish before the enemy could crush them. The deserter drilled them with merciless precision. No longer ragged strays fumbling with stolen rifles. They became soldiers who could move as one, who could hold a line against overwhelming fire. His voice no longer carried anger but iron discipline, and the forgotten followed it with unflinching resolve. The widow gathered those broken by grief and honed them into unyielding fighters. She taught them not only to endure pain, but to wield it, to let the memory of their fallen fuel every strike, every act of defiance. The miner, though his body bent with age and scars, reshaped his craft. His traps grew sharper, his fire deadlier. He carved the land into weapons so that every ridge, every canyon, every forgotten trail could bleed the enemy dry. And Ilara, she no longer bore the face of the forgotten girl. She carried herself with the bearing of a leader forged by trial and fire. She listened to her people, she studied her foes, she sharpened her vision until it cut through despair. Her voice no longer trembled, her steps no longer faltered. From the ashes of defeat, she had become something new, and so the world began to feel the turning storm. The first sign came when the enemy marched a convoy of supplies through a canyon, certain of their strength. They never saw the hidden fires waiting above, never heard the silent traps beneath their boots. When the roar came, it was not chaos, it was precision. Flames poured like rivers, rifles cracked from every shadow, and the convoy was reduced to ruin. The second sign came when villages once silent with fear began to resist. They had seen Ilara's army strike and vanish, and they found courage in that defiance. Farmers hid weapons beneath their fields. Shepherds carried messages across ridges. Women and children watched the roads, feeding whispers to the army like lifeblood. And the third sign came when the enemy themselves began to hesitate. Their patrols no longer strode boldly. Their officers no longer carried smug certainty. They spoke in hushed tones of shadows in the hills, of fires that devoured men whole, of an army that grew stronger the harder it was pressed. The storm was building. Each skirmish became sharper, each strike more precise. Each loss turned to iron in the hearts of the forgotten. And at the heart of it all was Ilara, the girl no one remembered, the girl who should have vanished into dust. The girl who now stood like a storm given flesh, gathering thunder in her wake. The forgotten were no longer simply fighting for survival. They were fighting for a future, and the storm was ready to break. There comes a moment in every struggle when the road narrows, when every choice leads to a single path, and that path demands everything. For Ilara and her army, that moment had arrived. The enemy had grown weary of endless raids, weary of shadows that struck and vanished, weary of being bled dry by the forgotten. They pulled their strength inward, drawing their soldiers, their weapons, their supplies into one place. A fortress carved from stone and steel, a bastion meant to crush all hope of rebellion. It was there the war would end. To strike such a stronghold was madness. High walls, heavy guns, soldiers seasoned in battle. Every rational voice whispered the same warning: turn back, wait longer, bleed them slower. But Ilara knew the truth. Time was no longer a weapon. Time was their enemy. The forgotten could not remain shadows forever. They had grown too many. They had drawn too much blood. The enemy would recover, would rebuild, would hunt them until nothing remained. If they did not strike now, they would wither in the dark. And so she chose the path of fire. Preparations began in silence. Scouts moved like wind, charting every road, every guard tower, every weakness. The miner bent his body past, breaking, shaping weapons of flame, of steel, of cunning. The deserter drilled until even the youngest recruit moved like a veteran. The widow carried grief in her voice, hardening spirits for what was to come. When the night before the siege fell, the camp lay quiet. There were no songs, no laughter, no boasting, only the steady weight of resolve. Every fighter knew what awaited them. Every heart carried the same oath: they would rise or they would fall together. Dawn broke, and the storm broke with it. The first strike came not with rifles, but with fire. The miners' work roared to life as hidden barrels erupted, turning the outer walls into a furnace. The defenders reeled, their lines thrown into chaos. Then the forgotten surged. They did not march like scattered strays. They moved as one, a wave of steel and fury. Rifles cracked in unison, blades flashed with precision, voices cried not in fear, but in defiance. The fortress groaned beneath the assault. Barricades fell, gates splintered. Towers shook with the force of flame and storm. The enemy fought with desperation. They unleashed volleys of gunfire. They rained iron from above. They pushed with shields and bayonets. But the forgotten did not break. For every fighter who fell, another surged forward. For every wall that loomed, they found a way to climb. For every wound cut into their ranks, their fury carved deeper into the defenders. And at the heart of it all was Ilara. She did not command from safety. She moved with her people, carrying her banner not as a symbol, but as a promise. Her presence cut through fear like steel through cloth. Where her figure rose, the forgotten roared louder, struck harder, endured longer. Hours bled into one another. Smoke blackened the sky. The ground trembled beneath the clash. The stronghold that had seemed unbreakable now groaned beneath the storm. And then, as the sun began to fall, the gates finally shattered. The forgotten poured through like a flood. The bastion of oppression cracked, and with it, the hold their enemies had pressed upon the land. But victory was not yet sealed. The fiercest fight still waited inside the heart of the fortress. The storm had broken the walls. Now it would decide the future. The walls had fallen. The gates lay in ruin. Smoke curled against the sky, heavy with the stench of iron and ash. The fortress that once seemed untouchable was now a battlefield of broken stone, scattered weapons, and the cries of those still clinging to life. The forgotten had stormed the heart of power, but the final cost remained to be paid. Inside the stronghold, the enemy's last defenders stood defiant. They fought not for hope, but for fear of what awaited them if they lost. They fought like wolves cornered, desperate and savage. The corridors echoed with gunfire, chambers filled with the clash of steel. The narrow halls became rivers of struggle, every step forward earned with blood. The deserter led his fighters through the barracks, his voice a steady command, even as bullets tore the air around him. The widow carved a path through the courtyards, her grief blazing into fury that no man could withstand. The miner too frail to carry a rifle, still carried flame, lighting the powder that broke barricades apart. And at the center of it all was Ilara. She moved like a shadow of fate, unyielding, untouchable. Her banner was torn, her body bruised, but her will did not bend. Every strike, every shout, every moment pushed her people closer to the heart of the fortress. At last, they reached it, the command hall, the core where the enemy's power had rooted itself. Here the fight was fiercest. Here the defenders poured out their final strength. The battle raged until the stones themselves seemed to cry out, yet inch by inch, breath by breath, the forgotten advanced. The last rifles fell silent. The last cries of defiance turned to silence. And then, in that silence, victory was born. The fortress stood broken. The banner of oppression lay in tatters. The forgotten, bloodied and battered, stood where no one believed they ever could. For the first time in memory, the land was free of chains, but victory bore its price. The ground was heavy with those who would not rise again. Faces once filled with hope now rested in stillness. Names once called in laughter would never answer again. Ilara walked among them, her heart torn between triumph and sorrow. She knew their sacrifice had carved this victory, and she knew their memory must never be lost. And so she made her vow, not only to the living, but to the fallen. The forgotten would not fade back into the dust. They would not become scattered once more. Their struggle would echo across the land. Their strength would build a new foundation. Their story would be told not as whispers, but as a legend. A girl who had once been overlooked, unwanted, unseen, had forged an army from the broken. She had risen from nothing to shatter a fortress. She had turned despair into defiance, grief into strength, shadows into a storm. And in doing so, she had rewritten the truth of power. No longer would the land belong only to the mighty. No longer would the forgotten kneel in silence. Her name would carry beyond the hills, beyond the rivers, beyond the graves. Not Ilara the orphan, not Ilara the wanderer. Ilara, the girl who was forgotten, yet made herself unforgettable. And her army, the nameless, the lost, the cast aside, would live forever in the legacy of the forgotten. And so the dust begins to settle. Yet the story of the forgotten does not truly end. For every victory carved in blood and fire, another horizon waits. Another land where voices long silent still cry out to be heard. Ilara's journey reminds us that even those the world tries to erase can rise, can fight, can leave a mark that will never fade. Now the question is this. If her army could rise from the ashes, what forgotten strength lies in your land? Tell us where you're watching from, because every voice, every place carries its own story worth remembering. If this tale struck your heart, let it live on, by leaving a like, by joining us with a subscription, and by marching forward to the next story waiting for you here on the channel. The frontier is wide. The legends are endless, and together we will ride into the next one.